Welcome to this introduction to the freshwater pearl mussel. Freshwater pearl mussels are invertebrate bivalve molluscs. And what this basically means is that they're animals without a backbone, with a soft body that's enclosed in two hard shells. Unlike the marine mussels that you might be a little bit more familiar with, these animals only live in freshwater habitats, like their name suggests. So you'll find them in rivers and streams and in some lakes. They also differ from the marine mussels in how they look. So their shells are a lot more oval in shape, they're heavier, and they grow to be an awful lot bigger than the marine mussels do as well. These animals are actually very long lived. So they can live to be over 120 years of age, making them one of Ireland's longest living animals. These animals are also really special because they're very sensitive to changes in water quality. And this means that you will only find them in places where the water is really clean. Pearl mussels spend pretty much all of their lives in the same place. They are found on the riverbed, either partly buried or almost fully buried in the sediment. While it might seem like a really boring life, just living in the one spot the entire time and never moving anywhere, they're actually carrying out a really important role while they're sitting on the riverbed. An adult mussel can filter up to 50 litres of water in just one day. And while they're filtering the water, they're also cleaning it. So they're removing lots of small particles from the water, including pathogens which can be harmful for human health. This filtering activity is important for the other animals that live in the rivers because it means that they have clean water as well. But it's also really important for humans because we get a lot of our drinking water from rivers and streams. So by protecting pearl mussels, we're also ensuring that we continue to get this natural water filtration system that's provided to us by the mussels for free. The life cycle of the pearl mussel is quite complicated, but it's really interesting. It's made up of a number of stages, and the pearl mussels rely on a salmon or trout to be able to completely complete their life cycle. Because these animals live for such a long time, it takes them until they're about 12 years of age to be able to start to reproduce. But once they start reproducing, they can continue to reproduce for their whole lives. The life cycle of the pearl mussel starts with adult mussels on the riverbed. In the summer, the male mussel produces sperm and releases this into the water. The female mussel inhales this and uses it to fertilize her eggs. While these eggs are growing and developing, she protects them inside her shells in a brood pouch. Once they've grown large enough, these larvae are then called glaucidia, and the female mussel will release them into the water. An adult female mussel can produce up to 4 million glaucidia in just one summer, but unfortunately, the vast majority of these won't survive to become adult mussels. The glaucidia look just like a miniature replica of adult mussels, but instead of having their shells closed, the shells are open as they float through the water. This next part of the life cycle is where the salmon or trout come into play. So to be able to move on through the life cycle, these glaucidia need to grab onto the gills of a fish. To be able to grab onto the fish's gills, they need to be inhaled by the fish as it's moving through the water. For this to happen, it's been estimated that you need about 500 reproducing adult mussels per half kilometre of river to make sure that there's enough glaucidia in the water so that a good proportion of them will be inhaled by passing salmon or trout. Once the glaucidia sense that they're close to the fish's gills, they start snapping their shells open and shut, and eventually will hopefully shut their gills on the fish's gills. Only 5 to 10% of Glaucidia will survive being attached onto the gills of the fish, but for those that survive this process, they will stay attached for about 9 months. The gills of the fish are a great place for these small mussels to grow and develop because it's got lots of oxygen. And while they're growing and developing, these small mussels are moving everywhere the fish moves. Eventually, when they've reached a large enough size, they will drop off the gills of the fish and start to sink down through the water column. Where they land is extremely important, as it will determine if they're able to survive to become adult mussels or not. To be able to survive, they have to land in a suitable habitat. So it needs to be clean water with a clean riverbed, a riverbed that's stable, and a riverbed and water that's well oxygenated. Unfortunately, these conditions are becoming quite rare in a lot of rivers and streams, and often mussels land in places that are not suitable and they don't survive. If they do land in a place that has good habitat, the mussels will bury themselves down into the riverbed so that they're protected from the flow of water in the river. And they will stay here for about 5 years, growing and developing. Once they're large enough, they push themselves up through the sediment and they will expose their shells to the river water. They're now large enough so that they don't get washed away and they can withstand the flow of water in the river. We already learned that the adult mussels are very sensitive to environmental conditions, but the juvenile mussels are even more sensitive to changes in environmental quality. So it's really important that there are good environmental conditions for these young mussels to be able to survive and become adults. While the young mussels are buried in sediment, they can't feed in the same way that the adult mussels do by filtering water from the river. So instead, these small mussels actually get food particles from the little spaces in the sediment. Seepage zones on the land are extremely important because they transport small bits of detritus and decaying plant material into the riverbed sediment, and this is what the mussels feed on. In the Pearl Mussel project, we recognise the importance of these areas and we reward farmers for protecting and conserving these areas. In a healthy population of pearl mussels, you would hope to find a whole size range of mussels present, from very small young mussels all the way up to large old adult mussels. In a healthy population that's able to sustain itself, so to keep having quite high numbers, you would hope that about 1/5 of the mussels would be young mussels. Unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more is that pearl mussel populations are just made up of the older adult mussels, and the smaller sizes are completely missing. And this means that when the adult mussels have died, there are no young mussels to replace them. Freshwater pearl mussels are currently classified as being critically endangered by the IUCN, and this is just one step away from being extinct in the wild. In Ireland, we're quite lucky in that the populations of freshwater pearl mussel that we have are still in quite good condition in some places in comparison to other parts of Europe. Our Irish pearl mussels are actually recognised as being of international importance, and we have 46% of the EU population of mussels. In 2013, it was estimated that there were just under 11 million mussels in Ireland. And while this sounds like an awful lot, it actually represents a decline of almost 10% since a survey that was carried out just 5 years earlier. Because we have some of the best remaining populations in Europe, we also have a big responsibility to make sure that we conserve these populations. Because they are so endangered, the freshwater pearl mussel is protected under law in Ireland, under the Habitats Directive and the Wildlife Amendment Act. There are 21 special areas of conservation designated for the protection of freshwater pearl mussel in Ireland, and this covers 27 freshwater pearl mussel populations. The best of these remaining populations are known as the top 8 catchments, and these are the catchments where the Freshwater Pearl Mussel Project is working. And combined, they account for 80% of the Irish freshwater pearl mussel population. Even though these are the best populations of pearl mussels we have left, they are still declining in numbers, and they do face extinction unless some action is taken. So the key reason why these populations are declining and why the pearl mussel is in trouble is that the juvenile mussels just aren't able to survive. There isn't enough clean habitat of high environmental quality available for the mussels to be able to survive and become adults. As you can see here from this picture, this small juvenile mussel has pushed its foot out of its shell, which means that it's trying to move to a new location. And this is a sure sign that it's under stress and that it's trying to get away and move to a place with better environmental conditions. As you can see, there's a lot of algae in the water, and it also looks like there's quite a lot of sediment around too. So this indicates that there's probably not much oxygen available and that the mussel is potentially going to die from oxygen starvation. The main threats and pressures that are affecting the environmental conditions that pearl mussels need to survive are flow, water quality, and the presence of excess sediment and nutrients in the water. The first one that I'm going to talk about is flow. So in particular, in the top 8 catchments in Ireland, flow is recognised as being one of the main threats for freshwater pearl mussels. And it's thought that if flow conditions were restored to what they should naturally be in these top 8 catchments, other factors like sediment and nutrients probably wouldn't have too much of a negative impact on the pearl mussels at these locations. One of the key problems with flow is that when we start to alter the flow of a river, so when we straighten the banks of a river, or when we deepen the channel, or even when we drain the land surrounding a river, we impact the river and how it flows. And this means that in times when the river would have a low flow, like in the summer when there's a drought, the flow becomes even lower than it normally would, and the drought conditions are more severe. Then conversely, when there are high flow conditions, like after heavy rainfall, when there's a flood, the high flows are even higher than you would expect. And these conditions aren't suitable for the pearl mussel. But under natural conditions, when there's been no alteration to the river channel and there's been no draining of the land around the river, you get a situation where the land adjoining the river acts like a sponge. So in times of flood, it can absorb the extra water in the river and regulate the flow so that it doesn't become too high. And then in times of low flow, it can slowly release this water back into the river channel. And it means that the flow of water in the river doesn't get too low. And these are the ideal conditions that we need for pearl mussels to be able to survive. Because we know the pearl mussel is very sensitive and it doesn't like water that's flowing too fast, because it can actually wash the mussels away, damage their shells and cause them to die. It doesn't like water that flows too slow, because this will lead to a buildup of sediment and low oxygen levels. So it likes a flow somewhere in the middle. That's almost called the Goldilocks flow. It's just right. It's not too fast and not too slow. So some of the supporting actions that are available through the Pearl Mussel Project to help to restore the natural flow of rivers and streams are drain blocking measures. So using things like peat plugs or plastic dams or wooden weirs to slow the flow of water in drains and to try and improve the flow of water in the rivers. Also allowing drains to vegetate up so that water can still flow through them, but the rate of flow is slowed. The next threat facing pearl mussels is sedimentation. So this is basically the movement of silt or peat, dead and decaying plant material into water. And it impacts both the adult mussels because silt or sediment can be suspended in the water column. And if there's too much sediment, the adult mussels will shut their shells. And this is okay for a small amount of time. But if their shells are shut for too long, it means they can't feed and they're not getting any oxygen from the water. So eventually they will actually die. And too much sediment also impacts the juvenile mussels because it blocks the spaces in the riverbed where they live. So again, under sort of natural conditions where there's been no impact or limited impact from humans, you get a lovely natural band of vegetation growing along the sides of rivers. And this is called a riparian zone, and it acts like a buffer. So it prevents extra sediment and nutrients getting into watercourses, but it also acts to stabilize the bank because the roots of the plants bind the soil together, making it strong and stable, and it means that the bank is unlikely to be eroded. And these plants also provide some shading, which can be really important because it helps to maintain a kind of a constant water level in the water, which can prevent too much algae growing. Sediment can be caused by a whole range of reasons. So it can be caused from livestock going into watercourses to drink or to cross. It can be caused by overgrazing or too much poaching on the land from overstocking, which makes a lot of bare soil, which can get washed into the river. And also by vegetation removal. So by removing this band of vegetation that occurs along the riverbed, you're promoting bank erosion happening, which will means more and more sediment ends up in the river. Again, it's the young juvenile mussels that are most sensitive to this threat. Because they're buried in the riverbed, they rely on an exchange of oxygen between the water in the river and the riverbed. But if there's too much sediment, this clogs up the spaces of the riverbed and means that there's not enough oxygen exchange between the water and the riverbed. And eventually they'll die from too little oxygen. As I already mentioned, having too much sediment floating in the water affects the adults because they close their gills up and they can eventually die from oxygen deprivation. But in less extreme conditions where there's a lot of sediment but not too much that the adult mussels die, it kind of stresses the mussels out and it can cause them to release their glaucidia too early. So there won't be salmon or trout around to catch the glaucidia. And it can also mean that the mussels reproduce less than they normally would. Again, there's a whole host of supporting actions that we co-fund through the Pearl Mussel Project to try and reduce the amount of sediment getting into watercourses. So some of these include fencing off watercourses, creating buffer zones along the riverbanks, installing bridges or livestock crossing points, and providing alternative drinking locations to ensure that animals don't need to go into the rivers to drink. The next threat that we're going to look at is nutrient enrichment. So this is basically an increase of nutrients, generally phosphorus or nitrogen in water systems. And it often comes about because of the inappropriate use of artificial fertilizers and inappropriate slurry spreading. Both phosphorus and nitrogen are quite toxic to freshwater pearl mussels, and the presence of them can really stress adult mussels out, and this can reduce their reproductive output and impact on their overall well-being and survival. It can also indirectly affect the adult mussels because these nutrients promote the growth of algae and other aquatic plants. These can sort of smother the mussels, as you can see here, but as well as that, when these plants begin to die and decay, you get a reduced amount of oxygen in the water, which will result in the death of both adult and juvenile mussels. So some of the different things that we promote through the Pearl Mussel Project are outwintering of cattle to reduce the amount of slurry spreading that needs to be carried out, reducing stocking density, and using split slurry applications. Other pollutants are also quite harmful to pearl mussels. Things like herbicides that might be used for killing rushes and lime that's used for liming the soil are also quite toxic to pearl mussels and can have negative impacts on them. But another key factor is the use of sheep dip. So if sheep dip enters watercourses, it reduces water quality and it can result in the death of adult mussels. So the death of a whole pearl mussel population has been recorded before after sheep dip was released into a river system. So in the Pearl Mussel project, if there are any issues with dipping tanks, with dip potentially entering watercourses, we co-support alternatives such as mobile sheep dipping or other means such as pour-on sheep dip or injectable sheep dip. So the Pearl Mussel project is working with farmers in the top 8 catchments to try and help to ensure the long-term survival of mussel populations. We aim to reward farmers that are producing good environmental conditions that will support the freshwater pearl mussel. We're focusing on the habitats on the land because ultimately what happens on the land influences the water quality of the rivers, and we're basically paying farmers for providing habitats of good environmental quality and clean water, and this payment is in recognition of the services that those healthy ecosystems and healthy river systems are providing. So thank you for listening. There is lots more information available on our website.